Mayoral candidate will be on the general election ballot despite an attempt to block her candidacy by an ally of current Mayor Tiffany Henyard, who is
a mayoral candidate being challenged. The saga surrounding embattled South suburban politician Tiffany
Henyard, once hailed as a trailblazer and beacon of hope for Dalton and Thorne Township, now faces a political crisis as her leadership is engulfed in mounting controversy. From an inspirational young black leader who shattered barriers to a figure mired in scandals, Henyard's journey has taken a dramatic turn. Once celebrated for her promises of transformation, equity, and inclusion, she now grapples with allegations of fiscal mismanagement, procedural misconduct, and ethical violations that threaten to undo her political career as mayor of Dalton and supervisor of Thorne Township. Henyard's administration has been accused of misallocating funds and engaging in questionable financial dealings, sparking growing distrust among the community she once inspired. Reports surfaced claiming that her leadership eroded the very systems of progress she had pledged to reform, leading to a sharp decline in public confidence. This shift in sentiment has been amplified by legal woes, including lawsuits and federal investigations that have intensified scrutiny on her actions once celebrated for her bold vision and dynamic governance. Henyard now faces vocal criticism from former allies, disillusioned constituents, and a media landscape that paints a portrait of a leader overwhelmed by scandal. The calls for accountability are mounting, with protests and petitions for her resignation becoming commonplace in Dalton and Thorne Township. As public discontent swells, contentious board meetings have become battlegrounds of political infighting and personal attacks. Further deepening the divides within her administration, critics argue that Henyard's failure to deliver on her promises of change has undermined the trust of the very community she sought to uplift. They point to allegations of financial mismanagement and ethical breaches as evidence that her administration has betrayed the ideals of equity and justice she championed. The mounting evidence of her missteps has prompted calls for audits, transparency, and a full investigation into the alleged misuse of public funds amid this growing crisis. Some supporters continue to defend Henyard, though their numbers are dwindling. They argue that her leadership has been sabotaged by entrenched resistance to her reform agenda and systemic barriers faced by leaders from marginalized communities. They believe that Henyard is a victim of the same inequities she sought to dismantle. But the narrative of systemic resistance is overshadowed by the relentless focus on the controversies surrounding her tenure. The leaked memos, whistleblower allegations, and internal disputes that have surfaced paint a grim picture of a leadership in turmoil. Once viewed as a unifying force, Henyard is now seen by many as a figure incapable of managing the complexities of governing two municipalities. The public's disillusionment has become palpable, and as federal investigations continue, her legacy as a transformative leader grows. Increasingly uncertain financial reports and allegations of mismanagement have only fueled calls for greater transparency and scrutiny. As her base of support dwindles, Henyard's defenders struggle to counter the growing body of evidence that paints a damning portrait of her leadership. The federal inquiries into her administration add to the speculation of broader issues within her governance. Further eroding public trust, Henyard's fall from grace serves as a cautionary tale about the complexities and burdens of public office, especially for leaders who confront systemic challenges with limited resources and overwhelming opposition. Her once promising political career now faces a critical juncture as questions about her competence, ethics, and ability to lead continue to dominate the discourse. Whether she can restore public trust and salvage her career remains uncertain, as the once hopeful vision of transformation is overshadowed by the weight of controversy for many. Henyard's story underscores the fragility of public trust and the harsh realities of political leadership. Despite her best efforts, she finds herself trapped in a storm of legal, financial, and ethical challenges. As the battle for her political future intensifies, the question remains: will she emerge from this crisis with her legacy intact, or will she become a cautionary example of promise undone by scandal? The outcome will shape how she is remembered and whether her story becomes one of redemption or a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by leaders navigating polarized political landscapes.
Tiffany Henyard was not at the hearing here today. Neither was her attorney, and she was not made available for.
Earlier this week, Tiffany Henyard, the embattled mayor of Dalton and supervisor of Thorne Township, further escalated public outrage by skipping two crucial meetings, one in Dalton and an emergency session in Thorne Township. She claimed that credible threats had been made against her and other officials, prompting her absence. However, The validity of these threats has been met with widespread skepticism, as neither trustees nor the public seem to have been made aware of any such claims. Her no-shows at these critical meetings have drawn sharp criticism, with many accusing her of using these alleged threats as an excuse to shirk her responsibilities during a period of immense importance for both communities. Jason House, a trustee who chaired the Dalton Village Board meeting in Henyard's absence, stated that neither he nor the board had any evidence to substantiate her claims. This only fueled the perception that her absence was part of a larger pattern of dysfunction and avoidance. Despite Henyard's absence, the Dalton meeting proceeded, though the atmosphere was charged with frustration as angry constituents filled the chambers to voice their discontent. Many residents accused Henyard of abandoning her duties at a time when decisive leadership was most needed. One resident remarked, "I heard you talk about being the dream once, but Tiffany, you were a nightmare," while another added sarcastically, "Come to work, sis." These comments highlighted not only Henyard's physical absence, but also a growing sense of disillusionment with her leadership, which many now see as failing to deliver on the promises of effective governance in Thorne Township. The consequences of Henyard's no-show were even more dire. An emergency meeting had been called to address urgent matters, including the township's lapsed insurance policy. Essential services, such as senior transportation and community programs, had already been forced to cease operations due to the lack of coverage, leaving vulnerable residents without access to vital resources. Trustee Chris Gonzalez, who had called the meeting, waited an additional 15 minutes for Henyard to arrive, but when she failed to show, the session was ultimately unable to proceed. Gonzalez later voiced the frustration felt by many, stating, "We're on a toll road of chaos right now, and unfortunately, the residents are the ones paying the tolls." His words underscored the growing disarray in the township. With Henyard's perceived inaction only deepening the crisis, the absence of leadership has fueled public frustration, particularly among those who rely on the township for essential services. Residents have voiced their anger at what they see as a failure of governance at a time of heightened need. Critics have accused Henyard of prioritizing self-preservation over her responsibilities as a public servant, furthering the perception that she is more concerned with avoiding accountability than addressing the immediate needs of her constituents. As the fallout from her absence continues to ripple through both Dalton and Thorne Township, the leadership vacuum she has created is deepening public distrust and worsening the already fragile state of local governance, instead of being the stabilizing force she once promised to be. Henyard's continued avoidance of critical responsibilities and her lack of communication have left residents feeling increasingly alienated and betrayed. This recent debacle adds to a mounting list of controversies surrounding her administration, from accusations of financial mismanagement to ongoing federal investigations and widespread dysfunction. Her critics, including trustees and former allies, argue that these incidents highlight a broader failure of leadership. Rather than confronting the challenges facing her communities, Henyard has instead chosen to deflect blame, further exacerbating the administrative chaos in her absence. As essential services continue to collapse under the weight of administrative neglect, community frustration has spilled into the public sphere. Packed meeting chambers and impassioned public commentary reveal a growing consensus among constituents that the mayor is failing in her duties. The recent events underscore not just the immediate consequences of her absence, but also a broader, systemic failure to lead. For many, Henyard's leadership, once seen as a beacon of change, is now emblematic of the dysfunction and instability she vowed to overcome for residents and trustees alike. The need for accountability, transparency, and a renewed commitment to effective governance has never been more urgent. Henyard's ability to recover from the mounting crises that have defined her tenure remains uncertain. But for now, the communities she serves are bearing the brunt of what many perceive as a failure of leadership at a time when decisive action was needed most. The growing frustration and disillusionment only raise the stakes for her political future, with public trust in her ability to govern quickly eroding as the situation in Dalton and Thorne Township continues to deteriorate. It remains to be seen whether Henyard can repair the damage and regain the confidence of her constituents. However, with each passing day, the pressure mounts and the prospect of redemption grows increasingly distant. Her story, once one of promise and potential, now risks becoming a cautionary tale of leadership lost to inaction and neglect at a time when her communities needed her most.
Behind me, the doors are locked here, and there's a sign on the building right now that says it's closed for how long? Neither residents nor employees.
Speculation continues to grow around Tiffany Henyard's decision to skip pivotal meetings in Dalton and Thorne Township, with many suspecting her absence is linked to mounting pressure from a government inquiry into alleged misconduct, including financial mismanagement, that has reportedly plagued her administration for months. Insiders suggest that formal indictments may be imminent, adding a sense of urgency and foreboding to her already embattled tenure. Henyard's critics point to a long list of scandals that have tainted her reputation. These range from accusations of mismanagement and misuse of township funds to a pattern of extravagant spending that has left the finances of both Dalton and Thorne Township in disarray. Reports reveal taxpayer-funded vacations and lavish expenditures that have drained local coffers, exacerbating the financial instability of the jurisdictions she oversees. A particularly striking example of fiscal irresponsibility came to light when Lori Lightfoot, former mayor of Chicago, conducted an analysis of Dalton's general fund and discovered it carried a staggering negative balance of more than $3.5 million. This alarming figure paints a bleak picture of how public funds have been managed under Henyard's watch. Adding to the controversy, a single-day spending spree involving $440,000 worth of Amazon orders has surfaced as a glaring symbol of fiscal recklessness. None of the purchases were accounted for or justified, deepening public outrage and prompting residents and officials to question how such gross mismanagement could occur under her leadership. Critics argue that these incidents reflect not just incompetence, but a disregard for the principles of transparency and accountability that Henyard once championed. Meanwhile, essential services like senior transportation and community programs have had to shut down due to the financial crisis, further highlighting the growing gap between Henyard's leadership and the needs of her constituents. In the face of these allegations, Henyard has offered little in the way of explanation or reassurance, fueling suspicions that her recent absences are an attempt to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. The situation has eroded trust in her administration, creating a governance crisis as both Dalton and Thorne Township struggle to maintain basic operations. Public sentiment has turned overwhelmingly negative as residents deal with the fallout from financial mismanagement, including a deteriorating quality of life and a troubling decline in essential services. Observers believe these failures are symptomatic of deeper systemic issues within Henyard's administration, where accountability and financial prudence appear to have been sidelined in favor of personal gain, and political maneuvering calls for immediate investigations and audits have intensified, with critics demanding to uncover the full extent of the financial irregularities that have left the townships in such dire straits. Residents are desperate for answers about how public funds have been misused, especially at a time when resources are critically needed to sustain essential services. As Henyard faces growing scrutiny, the allegations of misconduct and fiscal mismanagement cast a dark shadow over her tenure, raising serious questions about whether she can continue in her role. The administration's apparent inability to address these issues and Henyard's reluctance to engage with the public or her peers have further undermined her credibility, fueling mounting calls for her resignation. The urgency of this crisis has prompted growing demands for structural reforms to prevent such mismanagement in the future and restore public trust in local governance. For many, Henyard's tenure has become a cautionary tale of what happens when promises of transformational leadership clash with the harsh realities of mismanagement, lack of oversight, and the prioritization of personal and political interests over public welfare. The long-term implications of this crisis remain uncertain, but one thing is clear. Without significant changes, both Dalton and Thorne Township face a difficult and uncertain future. The cost of this mismanagement falls squarely on the shoulders of residents who can least afford it.
And no comment from Mayor Tiffany Henyard. Voters here will first head to the polls in February for the primary election, then the general.
The ongoing investigation into Tiffany Henyard's administration has revealed what many sources describe as a troubling disregard for legal and ethical standards, particularly regarding the suspected mismanagement of funds. Accusations of financial irregularities have sent shockwaves through Dalton and Thorne Township, eroding public confidence in Henyard's leadership. Current and former employees have come forward with claims that funds allocated for community projects have mysteriously disappeared without explanation. They allege a systemic pattern of concealment and fraud, which has left residents and officials alike demanding answers. One anonymous insider disclosed that invoices for certain expenses were either incomplete or entirely fabricated to obscure where the funds were actually going. This made it nearly impossible to track or justify expenditures. "It's like we run into a brick wall every time we ask for openness," the insider lamented, reflecting a sentiment of frustration shared by many within the administration. These troubling revelations have intensified calls for comprehensive audits of both Dalton and Thorne Township, with many demanding full transparency and accountability. As the allegations continue to mount, public trust has plummeted, with lawsuits against Henyard piling up. This has raised serious questions about the township's ability to function effectively amidst the growing legal and operational chaos. At a recent town hall meeting, one frustrated resident captured the collective anger, stating, "She's using every resource available to fight for herself, not for us," highlighting the perception that Henyard's focus has shifted from serving her constituents to protecting her increasingly tarnished reputation. Employees in Thorne Township have echoed these frustrations, pointing to the current insurance crisis as a glaring example of leadership failure. Essential programs designed to support low-income families and seniors have come to a halt due to unresolved issues with lapsed insurance policies, leaving vulnerable residents without access to critical resources. Programs such as senior transportation and community outreach, which had been lifelines for many, remain shuttered. The ongoing collapse of these essential services has compounded the hardships faced by those most in need. This situation underscores a broader pattern of neglect and dysfunction that critics argue has plagued Henyard's tenure. Allegations of financial mismanagement have overshadowed any attempts at governance, with community members growing increasingly disillusioned. Many are frustrated by the lack of action on pressing issues, while legal troubles consume much of the time and energy that might otherwise have been directed toward addressing the community's needs. The financial instability resulting from these controversies has made the challenges facing the local government even more difficult to overcome. Residents are now questioning how such a critical failure of leadership could have been allowed to persist for so long. Critics contend that Henyard's failure to address these issues has left the township in a state of paralysis, with lawsuits, investigations, and mounting public distrust creating an atmosphere of instability that threatens the very functionality of local governance. Calls for systemic change have grown louder, as residents demand accountability for what they perceive as egregious abuses of power and a blatant disregard for the well-being of the community. The situation has exposed the consequences of an administration that seems focused more on self-preservation than on public service. Many lament the loss of essential programs and the financial mismanagement that has crippled the township's ability to meet its obligations in this climate of mounting discontent. Henyard's leadership has come under intense scrutiny. Public discourse now revolves around questions of transparency, accountability, and competence, with residents growing increasingly vocal about their frustrations. Lawsuits continue to pile up, and calls for audits and investigations are intensifying, making it clear that the challenges facing her administration are becoming increasingly insurmountable. The sense of urgency among constituents is palpable. With essential programs still dormant and public trust in local government at an all-time low, the need for transformative leadership and meaningful reform has never been more pressing. However, for many, Henyard's administration no longer represents the solution to these challenges, but rather a glaring example of how mismanagement, lack of transparency, and a failure to hold leaders accountable can devastate a community. This has left the most vulnerable residents to bear the brunt of the consequences, whether the growing calls for audits, investigations, and reforms will lead to meaningful change remains uncertain. But what is clear is that the community is at a breaking point. Residents are desperate for a return to stability and effective governance in the face of overwhelming adversity. The need for leadership that can restore trust and address the pressing issues at hand is urgent. And whether Henyard can rise to the occasion or continue to be overwhelmed by the chaos surrounding her tenure will determine the future of both Dalton and Thorne Township.
To govern, to provide a way, provide services. And we're not doing that because they're stalling government, realistically, because they can't.
The governance crisis surrounding Tiffany Henyard has spiraled into a political debacle, defined by internal conflict, misconduct allegations, and increasing public outrage. Once celebrated as a rising political star, Henyard now faces accusations of prioritizing personal interests over her duty to serve. Even some of her closest allies have begun to distance themselves, reflecting the growing divide within her administration. Political insiders report a mass exodus of staff members, unwilling to tolerate Henyard's unpredictable leadership. This flight signals a deep morale crisis, with many questioning whether her career is unraveling. The rift extends to the governing boards of Thorne Township, where trustees like Harmon Carley and Chris Gonzalez have skipped meetings to block Henyard from appointing an ally to a vacant trustee seat, fearing it would consolidate her power. In response, Henyard has accused these trustees of stalling the renewal of essential insurance contracts, which has caused insurance costs to triple and burdened taxpayers with higher rates for reduced coverage. This deadlock has paralyzed local governance, leaving residents to deal with the fallout. Basic services are at a standstill, senior transportation and street maintenance are neglected, and problems like unlicensed animal control and delayed snow removal have further fueled frustration amid the crisis. Henyard's attention seems to have shifted from addressing her constituents' needs to pursuing legal battles. She recently filed lawsuits challenging her removal from the Thornton Township Democratic ballot and accusing Dalton trustees of conspiring against her. Critics argue that these legal pursuits have diverted resources away from critical governance issues, and many worry taxpayer dollars are being used to fund her personal vendettas. Public discontent has only intensified as legal experts and residents question whether the funds are being misused. Protests have erupted outside Henyard's mother's home, where demonstrators voice frustration with what they see as a squandered opportunity for effective leadership. Once hailed as the first female and youngest mayor of Dalton, and as a young black woman with the potential to inspire, Henyard's tenure is now overshadowed by scandals, mismanagement, and allegations of corruption. Critics claim her leadership has been driven more by self-interest and manipulation than by a desire to serve the community. Adding to the turmoil are reports of Henyard's personal financial issues, including late rent payments that led to eviction proceedings. Court documents reveal her landlord is seeking over $13,000 in unpaid rent and damages, and while Henyard reportedly vacated the property months ago, the situation remains unresolved. This personal crisis only amplifies the chaos surrounding her administration, which is already grappling with allegations of financial mismanagement. Accusations of misappropriated community funds, fabricated invoices, and missing project allocations have fueled calls for audits in both Dalton and Thornton Township to uncover the full extent of the financial mishandling. Opposing trustees have labeled Henyard's leadership a liability, citing the inflated insurance costs as a major example of her administration's financial missteps. Meanwhile, public frustration is mounting, with residents accusing her of deflecting blame and avoiding accountability. At town hall meetings and protests, Henyard has been criticized for failing to take responsibility for the ongoing crises. Claims made by Dalton's acting police chief about threats against Henyard have yet to be substantiated, leading some to believe her absences from key meetings are less about safety concerns and more about avoiding the heat of public scrutiny. Henyard's recent defeat in the Democratic caucus for Thornton Township Supervisor has only deepened the scrutiny surrounding her. Many see her loss as a referendum on her leadership, with widespread dissatisfaction within her administration and claims of manipulation contributing to her rejection. Despite Henyard's accusations that State Senator Napoleon Harris orchestrated the caucus to block her supporters, critics argue her defeat was inevitable. Given the growing public discontent and loss of faith in her leadership, rumors have also surfaced about a leaked audio tape, allegedly featuring a trustee boasting about inappropriate behavior in Las Vegas. Although the tape's implications remain unclear, its timing, coinciding with Henyard's absence from meetings, has fueled suspicions that internal power struggles and public scandals are intertwined. As public anger intensifies, residents are calling for transparency, accountability, and Henyard's resignation. Demonstrators have likened her administration to a sinking ship, weighed down by lawsuits, unkept promises, and failures in governance. Heading into the February primary election, Henyard's chances of turning things around seem increasingly slim. The momentum of her detractors continues to build, and with each passing day, the perception grows that her leadership has done more harm than good for Dalton and Thornton Township. The legacy of Henyard's leadership now risks being remembered not as a historic turning point, but as a cautionary tale. Whether she faces legal consequences or political ousting, the pressing question remains: who will step forward to repair the damage and guide these communities toward a more stable future? For now, residents brace themselves for more turmoil, uncertain of whether Henyard can salvage her administration or if the damage is beyond repair.